Hello and welcome to Capitol Hill. I'm Julie Doyle. Federal Parliament returns tomorrow and the government is hoping to get its mining tax through the Senate this fortnight. But the Greens are warning there could be some last-minute delays. Joining me today to discuss a busy week ahead, we have Labor MP Deb O'Neill and Coalition MP Steve Ciobo. Good afternoon to you both.
Good afternoon.
Well, before we get started today, a television commercial by Bob Katter's Australian Party has got everyone talking. It targets the Queensland LNP leader Campbell Newman about his stance on gay marriage. Let's have a look at it.
How well do you really know Campbell Newman? Do you think he'll stand up for your family values? Do you think he'll really stand up to the Greens and other minority groups? Then think again. The LNP leader supports gay marriage, just like Greens leader Bob Brown.
I support gay marriage. I support gay marriage.
That's right, he supports gay marriage.
I think this absolutely demeans Queenslanders. It doesn't represent the modern day Queensland or indeed the modern day Australia that most Australians and most Queenslanders understand.
That's the Green Senator Sarah Hanson-Young speaking a bit earlier today. Steve Ciobo, to you firstly, what do you think of that ad?
Well, look, I think that the ad really misses the mark, frankly. I mean, this isn't an election about Campbell Newman's position on gay marriage. This is an election about which is going to be the best government for the people of Queensland going forward. They've got a choice between, frankly, a broken down and tired old Labor government, a government that's simply been there for too long and made mistake after mistake, that's taken Queensland from being the low-tax state to now being one of the more highly taxed states, that's squandered the mining boom, unlike other states like Western Australia. So, to me, that ad is very wide of the mark. I don't think it's going to do much to influence anybody, frankly, and I think most people are very dismissive of it.
Deb, it's got a lot of publicity today. We're all talking about it. Wayne Swan has said today that he thinks it's over the top. What do you think of it?
Look, I have to agree with him. I made very clear statements myself on my view of retaining the current definition of marriage and support the Prime Minister in that. But we really don't need to move to things that could look homophobic to the community. Obviously, I think some people will be very offended by the ad, and it's quite over the top.
Well, moving on to the parliamentary week ahead, and the government is keeping the pressure on the Greens when it comes to the mining tax and its hopes to get the mining tax through the Senate. Let's hear from Wayne Swan.
We've got to make sure opportunity is spread right around our country. So at the moment we've got the MRRT legislation going to the Senate. When that passes, that will give a tax cut to 2.7 million small businesses. It will boost the superannuation savings of millions of Australian workers. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about opportunity.
We won't support the mining tax, full stop. It's a bad tax, and it's typical of a government which, whenever it's got a problem, thinks tax. Now, there are all sorts of difficulties that Australia faces, and none of them are going to be helped by a net increase in taxes.
That's the opposition leader there, Tony Abbott. Deb O'Neill, to you on this one. Is the government worried about the Greens delaying this legislation? Is that why we're seeing Wayne Swan out on the front foot on this one?
Look, I think the government's really worried about making sure that all Australians get a fair share of the incredible mining boom that we're having. And I think the Treasurer's words are absolutely to the point. We need to make sure that while we have this boom, we make sure that 2.3 million businesses get their fair share of it. And it's very important that this does go through the Senate this week or in this sitting period.
Now, the Greens are saying, though, that they want to see the legislation that relates to the cutting company tax. Isn't that fair enough that they want to see that detail first?
Look, it's absolutely fair that we want to make sure that all Australians share in this mining boom, including those big companies. But obviously there are some reviews that are underway. We're waiting for the detail to come through and report to the government this month. And we're absolutely committed to making sure that there is a fair share. You know, in contrast, Tony Abbott has got this $70 billion black hole. He's got no proposals to take tax from those companies that are absolutely making super profits and no intention to share it with any of the businesses in seats like mine, where many of those, a good number of those 2.3 million small businesses exist and stand to benefit from us getting this legislation through. So it is important that it goes through in a timely way and that businesses, local businesses who employ so many people in seats just like mine in Robertson, benefit.
Steve Ciobo, what's wrong with these mining companies paying their fair share for the use of our natural resources?
Well, they pay their fair share already. That's the key point. And I mean, you know, what I just heard, frankly, from Deb was justification for Labor's addiction to spending and addiction to higher taxes. I mean, the reality is very straightforward. If Labor was genuine about actually wanting to push this through the Senate as quickly as possible, then it would respond to the very reasonable and fair-minded comments that have been made by the Coalition and by the Greens. And we've said this. Why doesn't Labor release the modelling? Why doesn't Labor release the assumptions? You know, it's a matter of standard procedure that at a state government level, they release the assumptions on quantities and the assumptions on the price of commodities. And yet Wayne Swan won't release any of this information federally. I mean, if this goes down in a smouldering heap, there's no one to blame but Wayne Swan, because instead of actually letting the sun shine in, as the Prime Minister once famously said, they're involved in a cloak and dagger exercise, and they're simply not being upfront and frank with the Australian people.
Deb O'Neill, could the government release this information? Should there be more out there in the public domain?
Well, I think that Steve is sort of trying to hide the fact that where the light really needs to shine is on the $70 billion worth of cuts that they have to come to grips with before we really begin to have a look at from your own team,
Get to that one. We will get
because the reality is
in a minute. But back on the mining
we've
tax.
got so many people who stand to benefit from this great period in Australia's history where we do have a mining boom, where companies are making super profits. We want companies to be able to bear their fair share and spread the opportunity to all Australians in the regions by investing in infrastructure that will support those regions, and also particularly to support small business. And then, of course, there's 8 million workers who stand to benefit from a better retirement when this legislation is passed. It's been passed through the House of Representatives. I see it as very reasonable to ask that it go through the Senate now and that we move on. But the reality is the $70 billion hole that the Liberals have got is what they're trying to paper over all of the time. We already had $1 billion worth of cuts from Tony Abbott when he was the Health Minister, and that did not create a good look in my electorate, let me tell you.
Steve Ciobo, I'll give you some time to respond to that.
Well, look, I mean, it's simply unsubstantiated. You know, Labor likes to bandy this figure around, but the reality is that there's absolutely no basis for that claim at all. No basis whatsoever. And you see, the issue is this. Under the previous coalition government, when we enjoyed the so-called mining boom Mark I, the coalition did several key things. We ran budget surpluses. We repaid $96 billion of Labor Party debt, and we improved services across the country. That was the coalition's legacy. Under the so-called mining boom Mark II, under the Labor Party, they're now borrowing $100 million a day. They're racking up net debt of around $130 billion. And what's more, when Labor tries to fudge this link between an increase in compulsory superannuation going up to 12%, it's not the Labor Party that's paying for that. It's not government that's paying for that. That's paid for by the employers of this country.
On the figures, though, I mean, you're talking about repealing the tax that will cost the opposition revenue. Do you have concerns about where you're going to get that money from, how you're going to fund your promises?
Look, the level of spending waste by this government is so obscene that I have no doubt whatsoever that we'll be able to find significant savings in the budget. And that's indeed part of the reason why Tony Abbott announced one of the first things we do is establish a commission of audit. You see, under the Labor Party, we've seen the pink bats fiasco, the school halls fiasco. I mean, the list is as long as your arm.
But on that audit commission, on those savings, one of the measures that Tony Abbott talks about is the public service, and he talked about that again last week. We saw the ACT Liberal Senator Gary Humphries for Canberra saying that he doesn't think there is a lot of fat left in the public service. So do you disagree with that?
Absolutely, I do. Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt that there is room to move in terms of the number of bureaucrats in Canberra. And what we outlined was that we would stall the number of new employees at a federal government level because there are significant cost savings there. But there's a whole range of programs that the Labor Party's put forward which, frankly, are wasteful in their spending. The most recent one, of course, announced in last year's budget was the set-top TV reception boxes, which, you know, the government's paying something like $450 a pop for when you could actually buy a brand new TV for cheaper than that. So I'm not concerned at all as a member of the coalition that we both have the past track record of performance and delivering in this area, but more importantly we've got plans that we know will be able to save significant taxpayer dollars in the future.
Deb O'Neill, what's your response to that? Do you think that there is that room to move in the public service, that those savings can be made?
Well, we've heard a lot of facts, figures and numbers, and again it's a smoke and mirrors job, because in reality what it looks like when you cut in the way that the Liberal Party cuts is that there are longer queues in our hospitals, in our emergency rooms. There are people waiting for surgery. There are jobs programs and apprenticeship schemes that get cut. That's what they're talking about when they say cuts to services. It's cuts right into the heart of communities. Cuts that we've seen since the New South Wales government's become the O'Farrell Liberal government. Cuts to services at a local school in Springfield where there was a fantastic community program going, making sure kids kids were engaged in schools, had long-standing success. It's been cut. So that's what we mean when we see cut to services.
But the government has also talked about increasing the efficiency dividends. So the public service has had issues with that. Some of the smaller agencies have been hit very hard by that as well.
And that's why it's important that we find out where the Liberals are going to get all of the money that they're not going to get when they don't have a mining resource rent tax, and they keep the money in the pockets of those who are making super profits at this period of time.
Steve,
just don't share it around the rest of the country.
One of the schemes that Tony Abbott has talked about is the paid parental leave scheme. He says it's a signature policy for him. Do you think it's too generous?
It's a productivity measure. Tony's made it very clear that this is a workplace entitlement in the same way that there is, for example, sick leave. So this isn't welfare. This is talking about boosting productivity.
But do you have any concerns about the cost involved?
The Coalition is absolutely committed to making sure that Tony delivers on his paid parental leave scheme. I mean, look at the differences between the Coalition's policy and Labor's policy. Under Labor's policy, there's no super contribution, and it's at the minimum wage. Under the Coalition's policy, it's a replacement wage up to the cap, and it also pays into superannuation. But I just want to quickly come back to something Deb said about the resource rent tax when she said, where's the money going to come from? You know, under the resource rent tax, in the first 12 months, it provides a surplus to the budget. It provides extra funds to the budget. But for the next year, for the years after that, it actually runs at a deficit level to the budget. So this notion that Deb says about where's the money going to come from, by scrapping that tax, you actually save the budget money. So, you know, I think, Deb, you need to go back and do your homework on that.
Well, it's a nice argument, but that's the problem. There's lots and lots of talk from the Liberals, but not a lot of delivery. Yeah. You know, they had 12 years in government to get on and do a paid parental scheme. We didn't see it then.
Just
it took
on
a Labor
that, Deb,
government
I do want to get to you quickly on the paid parental leave scheme. What Steve talked about being paid at your real wage, making this a workplace entitlement rather than a welfare entitlement. Do you think, though, working women would look at the scheme being offered by the Coalition and think it is better for them, they would be better off under that scheme?
I think that there are 140,000 families who have already registered with the scheme that we've got in place, which
but they're getting the minimum wage. They're not getting their real wage.
It's a responsible financial support for families that was never undertaken under the Howard or the Liberal government when they had the opportunity. And in all those years of surplus, they never thought to spend a cent of it on paid parental leave. Now they want to come up with some Rolls-Royce scheme where a person who earns $150,000 gets $75,000 and somebody who's on a small wage gets a whole lot less than what we're offering currently. There are 875 families in my electorate that are getting that money right now, and it's changing their lives. There are 80,000 families across Australia as of today receiving that money that only a Labor government got on and delivered.
But
so
it's
if
a different approach,
let's talk about ideas and possibilities and grand plans and we'll cut and there's plenty of waste. This is the talk we hear from the Liberals all of the time. The reality is Australians need the opportunity to really live a great life, and it's only Labor who's delivering for ordinary Australians, making sure we get a fair share.
All you're delivering is debt. We have your government buying. See, this is the thing. You know, the Labor Party's out there professing to deliver all these wonderful things for the Australian public, but never mentions the fact that they are borrowing $100 million a day. When you talk about projects
big scary
in schools,
numbers don't reflect the reality that the Australian economy
we'll have to cut it off there, I'm afraid. We'll have to leave it there. We are about to run out of time, so thank you both very much for joining me today.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
And we'll be back again with Capitol Hill at the same time tomorrow.